was one incident, and I'm not singing out Scott Steiner, but Scott Steiner went on TV and went in business for himself in an interview. It was the next pay-per-view was coming up. He was to say something very short that triggered a statement next by Jeff Jarrett to the Magic Sign by Jeff Jarrett that was integral to promote the pay-per-view. It's a revenue stream. Scott got sideways about something, went in the ring and went on a tirade about Ric Flair that had nothing to do with anything. And it was like, it's like, if you just ignore this, the inmates are running the asylum. And Scott got called to task for it. Then immediately it became personal. That there were people there that were trying to get Scott fired, trying to protect their own jobs, trying to increase their own importance, whatever it was. And so Scott, it ended up, we felt that we had to make an example. It ended up, some wanted to fire him. Some said, fire him. Some said, give him a month off without pay. We ended up as little as you could, which was one pay period without pay. Well, to him, that was unacceptable. So his lawyer calls Brad Seigel, and it ended up being overridden. So now it's like Brad Seigel is intervening in something that he knows nothing about, and basically killed Bill Busch's credibility, which in turn killed my credibility. And then he was going back on cutting interviews on these call-in things, basically saying, "Oh, these people are trying to get me fired," and I guess I showed them, that kind of thing. And Scott, in his own mind, I came and sat in a room with him and tried to explain to him how what he did was unacceptable. Hulk had done something about Flair, and I said, "Whoa, apples and oranges." Hulk did something to further a storyline, and that was discussed as part of what he was going to say. But it was very difficult to sit down with Scott. But that was an example of how much disarray there was at that point.
What was your role when Bill Busch came in?
Well, Bill Busch had been the chief accounting guy under Eric Bischoff. Eric would get a wild idea. Bill would then have to put it on paper and present it with numbers, and then Bill would go with Eric down to see Schiller and whoever at the North Tower, and then Eric would sell the idea, and Bill would be there to answer questions. So if anybody in the company knew Eric Bischoff's shortcomings, limitations, it was Bill Busch, and knew that he was smoking mirrors. But he also knew what was going on at WCW. So Eric, because nobody knew, Eric, it had 6 months before the collapse came, two people there in the company knew where we were heading. I was one, Kevin Sullivan was the other. We knew, because we had worked in the small territories. We'd worked with the Eddie Brands. We knew what was going on, and they would run the Georgia Dome, or the Georgia Dome, and have 25,000 people in there, and all the bigwigs would come down from CNN Tower, and they would look in there and think that, oh, everything's all right. Kevin and I knew that we were a freight train heading for the wall, but nobody else knew because they were a TV company. They weren't a wrestling business. Nitro on a Monday started as an hour and 15-minute show. It went to an hour 30, then it went to 2 hours, then it went to 3 hours, and then they added 2 hours on Thursday. My fear all along was that this was going to be perceived after a while as MASH or Bonanza or whatever, that it's like we're getting a number now. So like, who wants to be a millionaire? If we're getting a number one night a week, can you imagine what we get if it's on 2 nights a week, if it's on 3 nights a week? And didn't realize that there's a supply and demand thing here. But again, they weren't wrestling people, and what I never thought would happen, but feared would happen, did happen. That they finally, it ran its course, and they lost a ton of money, and they pulled the plug. But they weren't in the wrestling business; they were in the television business. But it was ratings, and that was their barometer. It's kind of like if you live in a town and you got 2 produce dealers. selling watermelons. And the one guy goes out and gets a truckload of watermelons for 75 cents a piece. And he goes and does a big sale where he says, if you buy one, for $1, I'll give you the other one for free or for 25 cents. And he's selling the watermelons as fast as they could bring them in. And he's got stacks of money, and the watermelons are going out. The guy down the street buying the watermelons for 75 cents, and he's selling for 89 cents. And he's doing a steady business. He keeps his place looking nice. Whatever. All of a sudden, here's this one guy, and I say, wow, have you see how much did he deposit this week? Oh, my God, the money. And all of a sudden, that's what the ratings game was. It was like, my God, look at the watermelons he's selling. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, wait a minute. We lost X number of dollars. At the time that Eric Bischoff was replaced, they were reportedly losing $5 million a month. And all of a sudden now the glow was off. And it's like, and it happened in the wrestling business, it happens like that. And he was in a panic. And he was when the ratings pendulum started going the other way, it was like, I want an angle every quarter hour. And he got involved in creative. Well, Eric would sit in a room with a blank piece of paper. And for as long as he was in the room, no one would know if it would get written down because he had no clue about how to write a TV show. And it was only when he got out of the room, and then when a TV show would get written, he would look at it, give his blessing, and then between that time and Monday when you would get to TV, talent would get to him or somebody would get to him, and he'd walk in that day and he said, I don't want that in my show, I don't want that in my show. Whoa, where'd this come from? He was so manipulated. And when he was replaced, it was reported that WCW was projected to lose about $15 million, which is a lot of money, but given the amount of programming that they were doing and still getting in the twos, it was manageable. It was Bill Busch knew that Eric was bad news, and he knew that he didn't understand wrestling and that it was a talent-driven business, that my experience was the management of talent. And I could tell him, I said, your labor costs, and you talk about labor as talent, you're in a structure of a budget for the company, your labor costs traditionally in the business are 25%. Whether you're Jerry Jarrett, whether you're Jim Crockett, whether you're Vince McMahon. And if they get above that, you can't stay in business. That's where you've got to keep it for this business to work. WCW's talent costs were in excess of 50%. And a lot of it was guaranteed with no outs. And at that point, could it have been fixed? I want to say that I think it could have. Would it have been a lot of work? It's kind of like a guy that's in a horrible wreck that gets carted into the emergency room, and he's got cuts everywhere. And it's like, which one do we try to treat first? Which one seems to be bleeding? Well, this one, let me try and get this fixed, and I'll move over to this now. Any one of them, you can get infection in there. It's like, is this going to work? You don't know. But until you look at a wound and say, I want to start here, the more you sit, look at it, talk about it, the worse that person's getting. They went to shock or whatever. That was the shape of WCW. And it would have taken, because some of those contracts had 2 and 3 years to run, and you had to start somewhere. And to have had Harlem Heat both making big money. You look at Booker T and you say, they're brothers and they started as a team, but there's money with Booker. He can do so much for you that Stevie can't. Does it mean Stevie's not a good guy or doesn't deserve to have a job? No. But all of a sudden you can't be looking at the two of them as equals. And so that's a starting point. So there was a lot of resistance. Somebody's come in and turned the apple cart around. And wrestlers are the kind of people that they think it's going to last forever. And they would run it into the ground till they close the doors and then say, well, we should have done something different. We should have made some adjustments. And so that's what we tried to do. The problem was that Brad Seigel, who was the head of the network, when Schiller was gone, Brad Seigel looked at it, I'm sure, and he said, I'm doing these big money deals out in California, these made-for-TV movies. I got to deal with talent. I got to deal with producers and writers. And my secret of success has been separating the business from the creative, and that's the formula I'm going to do here, and I'm going to fix this thing. And I think he looked at it as an easy fix that would be a huge feather in his cap. And he got into it and found out real quick that it was a mess. And then he wanted instant results. And Bill Busch spent more time trying to deal with the Brad Seigels of the world rather than focusing attention on how we could fix it.
Watch thousands of exclusive shoot interviews right now on TitleMatchNetwork.com.